ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the zombie train. I almost said welcome back to Under Construction, but this is the zombie train. Sorry for the stutter. Episode 246. Rating for gas. This is a question postulated by Eastrail11, and I'll get to it in just a second. This episode of Under Construction I was working on mainly roadways and then continuing the railway. I had Madison with me, advising me on a couple of things, gave me a good idea. And we talked a lot about rivers and how sort of erosion works and how water is the biggest effect on anything. So if you want to hear about that, if you want to check that video out, go ahead. It's all of this in real time. It's what the footage is from. And now let's continue on to our question. The full wording of the question, which actually I'm not sure I read because I missed something. Did you ever loot gas station for fuel? And was anyone born on the zombie train or in the company? I also think I asked the question. I think you're referring to the one in the episode. But at any rate, I didn't actually notice the second part of the question until just now, or at the very least I failed to write it down. So I just did. Unfortunately, it's at the bottom of a list that is rather long, but I'll get to it eventually. Sorry about that. So, at any rate, we have this question about rating for gasoline. You know, specifically, did you ever loot gas station for fuel? Yes, of course. You know, if you had a siphon or a pump, you were miles better than anybody else in terms of being able to get your hands on gas. I mean, siphons aren't difficult because it's just a tube, but you can siphon gas out of a tank. It's difficult to siphon, or, you know, tank of a car, I should say. It's difficult to siphon gas out of a tank of a car, or sorry, a tank of a gas station that's buried, 10 feet in the ground. So, we would have a special pump that was used just for pumping gas because we didn't want to contaminate anything else. Most of our pumps were used for water and stuff like that. And also it was a pump that was, I guess you could say, for that kind of thing because it was not, there was no danger of it igniting the gas that you were trying to pump. Now, most pumps that isn't really a problem, but you don't want something that could possibly spark and, of course, blow the whole thing up. So, that was a consideration when we were doing that. And we did have a tank car that we kept full of gasoline, or well, not full because we never really had that much, but we had a tank car that we used for gasoline, and of course, jerry cans that would go with any of the road vehicles that we kept on the train, which we normally kept one or two. And for a time we had like a couple ATVs in the boxcar, but those proved to not be as useful as you might hope. They were too loud, and they used too much fuel, and there weren't too many times where we had to go that far in the woods, or, someplace where you couldn't just take a Jeep, which was our main thing, like a Wrangler type Jeep. So, we did go through quite a bit of gasoline. We tried not to. Because it was kind of a rare commodity, and I've talked about how difficult it was to get our hands on petroleum products, and how that really sort of became our end-all, be-all in trying to get refining up and running. Like, to make it possible for us to refine gas, and diesel, especially for locomotives. But I could chronicle, I could say, oh, there was this time, and this time, and this time, but it was countless, where you'd go into a gas station that didn't look like it'd been, really messed up, because some of them just got torched, some of them suffered some rough fates, but we'd go to one that wasn't too messed up, we'd go to one, that hadn't had the pumps, like, destroyed, because sometimes people would drive into them, or, stuff like that. You had a lot of people that I suppose they thought that meant that you could access the gas at that point, although I'm not sure where you would necessarily get that idea, because gas is pumped. It's a gas pump because it pumps. not because there's gas under pressure underground and you just need to somehow open it up so that it springs forth. But that was a misconception, I guess, that some people had, because they would destroy the gas pumps. And this was not something unusual, which was strange to me. But anyways, we'd find one that was relatively intact, and we'd drive the Jeep over to it, and we'd have to use drums, which we had a couple of oil drums as well. But those were, well, they didn't stay in gasoline service because we had a tank car and we had jerry cans. They were sort of a middle that we only used for when we were getting gas from a station that was not near the train tracks. Because if it was close to the train tracks, we would pull up and we'd pump the gas directly into the tank car where it belonged, or into the vehicles if they needed it. But we had a couple of drums, and so you would have to do it drum by drum, and it would take a long time. We would end up, if we had a full station and an empty tanker, we would have to go, drum by drum for, hours on end. And meanwhile, defend that whole operation. If there were zombies, we'd have to bug out. If there were people, we might have to bug out. I mean, obviously, the zombies isn't a absolute, oh, there's one, we have to leave. But usually you wouldn't just find one, especially towards the end of the war. Because, I mean, and that's kind of counterintuitive, because you'd think as they were killed off, or as they slowly, and I mean really slowly, decompose. I've talked about that before a little bit. And somebody asked a question on it recently that I'll have to address down the road. But as they slowly became less whole and were less mobile, then, yeah, you'd see them start to thin out a little bit. But generally, the ones that got killed were ones that were singletons, or, in small groups, and they tended to group up, not because of some herd mentality, not because they were smart enough to do that, but because of the simple fact that when someone is getting eaten, or at the very least, someone's being chased down by a zombie, there's a lot of noise that gets made, either from the human or from the zombie moaning. And I've talked about how those moans can sort of carry on the wind very, very strong, very far. They happen to be very good at vocalizing something that can be heard in many directions. And it's not something I do consciously, because they're zombies, they're not smart enough to do that. But it's something that they do. I guess something that the virus has evolved to cause. Because without that grouping up, you can take down one zombie pretty easily, as long as it doesn't get the drop on you or overpower you, especially if you have a weapon. So, that said, the zombies that we found later on, especially, were ones that had grouped up based on all of these zombies heading towards a relatively exposed or loud food source. And so you would have zombies that were making noise, other ones around them would hear them, and they would make noise, and they would come together, and they would start sort of walking together-ish, because zombies wander aimlessly unless they detect food, unless they hear something or see something that they want to sink their teeth into. So they would just sort of be a clump, a relatively loose clump, but still a clump, until something else piqued their interest, and then they would all move together, and they'd probably run into another similarly sized group, or any other group at all, and just become a bigger group. And so you'd get bigger and bigger and bigger groups of zombies, and so as the years went on, it became much more difficult to be able to fight them on the run. It was more of a, if there were zombies, you would have to post up, you'd have to get ready to stand your ground, and you might even have to build some fortifications in order to take them all out. And failing that, you would just have to leave. You would just have to run. In some way. And so we got pretty good at that, both in estimating the size of groups without being in the middle of them, and figuring out when we had to bug out, when it was not worth it, and when we could stand our ground. So, and that wasn't something that we learned right away. We had an incident, I guess you could call it, that was in fact a gas station. That was on, I want to say it was in Schenectady. And you know what? Now I want to figure out where this was. I need to look it up on the maps. Let me pull something out here, because we were not too far from the train tracks, but it was too long to run a hose or a pipe. And we started seeing zombies on the other side of the river, I believe. We were seeing zombies across the way. I'm not sure if it was while we were at the gas station or while we were on the road back and forth. But we started to see them, and there were maybe a dozen of them, and we were a little bit concerned, but they were over there, and firing guns would have been louder than their moans. Thankfully, the wind was in a favorable direction. And then, they were clumping up on the shore, and there started to be more of them. And we started getting kind of concerned, because people had sort of figured that we'd overstayed our welcome, so to speak, and we should really bug out. We should cut and run and just leave and go to a different gas station. But this was our first opportunity to fill up in a little while. And I sort of just said, no, stay here until we have a problem on site. And because the zombies were across the way for almost all of it, then I sort of figured at least that they weren't going to be a major issue, at least until they managed to wade across, or they don't really wade, but they would just, because they sink. Zombies aren't buoyant. Unless they get bloated from decomposition, which takes a long time for a zombie. So they would just sink, and they'd walk along the bottom of the river. So you would get surprised when they showed up. But we did post a couple of guards, and we said, listen, if you see, I can't find the right map. If you see any, coming across, then say something, and we'll see what we can do about it. So we'll see what we're going to do about it. Because we wouldn't have been able to, because firing would have given our position away. We wouldn't have been able to pick them off without possibly making things worse for ourselves. And I didn't really want that to happen. Yeah, let's see. I found the river. I'm trying to figure out where the gas station was. We weren't, the train was parked inland, and we had to go from the gas station by just a way we could see. Yeah, it wasn't on the waterfront. The gas station, I don't think, was on the waterfront. It was close to. But when we were driving back and forth from the train to the gas station, we'd be able to see across the river. Now, allegedly, some guys were trying to come across on the bridge. There was a railroad bridge. There was a highway bridge further down that we didn't notice first, and we sort of figured they didn't know about, or they hadn't found, they hadn't stumbled upon. And then they sort of came out of the woodwork. They came out of the woods behind the train because we had been stupid, and it wasn't the two bridges that were nearest that was the problem. It was another one, and it was also a stretch with an island in the middle of the river, so it was easier for them to get across. And that was a mistake. Mistakes were made, of course. And then suddenly the train was assaulted, and we were cut off from the train. The train, I was not with the train. Nobody could run the train. They could not leave on their own, and we had to fight our way back to it. Meanwhile, the train had to basically fight for its own life, which isn't something we wanted. It's not something you want to happen. You don't want to put the train in that sort of situation. It wasn't, as much as it was a forward operating base, it was not as much of a fortress as one might have hoped. So, anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you more next week. And I hope I answered your question, and feel free to ask many, many more. Trainman out.